On June 30th, 1934, the Nazi regime unleashed a brutal internal purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. Adolf Hitler, fearful and pressured by the military elite of the growing power of the SA, ordered the systematic elimination of his own comrades. Among them was Karl Ernst, one of the most prominent leaders of this paramilitary organization, a figure close to Ernst Röhm and singled out for his past as a bouncer in a homosexual nightclub and for his ties to Berlin's gay scene. Karl Ernst was arrested while returning from his honeymoon, flown from Bremen to Berlin under SS custody. There he was taken to the Lehrter Strasse prison, where he was denied any defense or appeal. According to some accounts, he was forced to strip, humiliated, beaten, and finally shot in the prison basement, where his body was shot multiple times at point-blank range. His body was never returned to his family. The rise of Karl Ernst in the Nazi Party and his role in the SA. On June 30th, 1934, the chief of the stormtroopers, Karl Ernst, a former prostitute who had risen to the highest ranks in the Nazi regime, was about to begin his honeymoon. SS agents surrounded him at the port of Bremen. The man who for years had hidden his personal life while violently controlling the streets of Berlin understood that he was about to be eliminated. Hitler had decided to eliminate several of his own, and Ernst, with all his secrets, was the first to fall. Some members of the SA nicknamed him Frau von Herbin. After being captured, he was taken to Berlin, where he suffered beatings before being executed. After the end of the Great War in 1918, Germany was completely transformed. The agreement signed at Versailles a year later placed the blame squarely on the country for the conflict, imposed massive sanctions, cut its army, stripped it of its regions, and left it with very limited sovereignty. These measures caused anger and frustration throughout the country. The new parliamentary republic was formed in 1919 but faced problems from the start. There were attacks by extremist groups on both sides, hyperinflation in 1923, and constant internal fighting. For a time, Berlin became known for its artistic and cultural life, but that era was cut short by the global economic collapse of 1929. This disaster worsened poverty and unemployment in Germany. It was then that Hitler's party began to rise. With nationalist, racist, and military strength messages, it managed to attract thousands of followers. In this context, armed groups emerged across the continent. Some were far-right, others left-wing. In Germany, one of the most active was the Freikorps, which included retired war soldiers. The Freikorps was used several times to crush communist protests. Over time, many of its members defected to Hitler's movement. In 1920, a new armed group linked to the National Socialist Party was formed. They called it the Sturmabteilung, or SA, which in German means assault section. It had several functions: guarding party events, distributing propaganda, fighting opponents, and providing military training. The SA became famous for its violent attacks on communists and other people opposed to Nazism. With the economic crisis, the SA began to receive more and more members. In 1926, there were 6,000. In 1930, there were already 60,000. In 1931, there were 77,000. By November of that same year, there were 221,000 people. By August 1932, the number had already reached 485,000. And when Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, the SA already had 3 million members, far more than the regular army, limited to 100,000 by the Treaty of Versailles. Karl Ernst was one of the fastest risers within the SA. In 1927, he began to rise to prominence in Munich, and by March 1931, he was leading important sections of the group. His career advanced further when he received the endorsement of Röhm, the supreme commander of the SA. Despite comments and rumors about his orientation, Ernst remained steadfast in his position. During this time, there was an internal struggle within the SA. In 1931, the leader in Berlin, Walter Stennes, rebelled against Röhm. He said he would never obey a man like him, whom he described as homosexual and surrounded by male prostitutes. Among those mentioned was Ernst. Even so, Hitler replaced Stennes with Paul Schulz, who in turn promoted Edmund Heines and Karl Ernst in the command structure. That same year, 1931, Karl Ernst's position grew stronger. The most loyal members of the party respected him, and his position in Berlin gave him great power. In a short time, he became one of Röhm's most trusted men, and for this reason, he was a target of suspicion and criticism. However, for Hitler, Ernst was useful. He organized, executed orders without hesitation, and maintained control of the streets. This made him valuable in moments when political fights became physical. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler took control of the government. By then, the SA had become an armed and numerous monster. Ernst remained in command of the Berlin region and executed the party's orders without question. His power grew along with that of the regime, and he seemed untouchable. In this context, violence became part of everyday life. The SA didn't just beat communists, they also intimidated opponents, organized marches, and took over public spaces. Ernst used all these resources. It was said that he controlled the city with an iron fist and without limits. His presence was noticeable in every act of repression. However, this power aroused fear. The regular army, severely limited by the peace treaty, watched with concern as the SA grew and armed itself. Röhm, head of this parallel force, openly spoke of merging the SA with the army under his command. This provoked rejection from the generals. For Hitler, the pressure was clear: either get rid of Röhm and his men or risk the support of the armed forces. It was then that an internal cleansing began to be planned. Himmler and Göring, heads of the secret police and the SS, collaborated with Hitler to identify the SA leaders who should be eliminated. On that list were Röhm, Heinrich, and Karl Ernst. All held key positions, all close to each other. Carl Ernst, meanwhile, suspected nothing. He was on his honeymoon, traveling through the north of the country. His plan was to embark from Bremen to Tenerife. But before he could set sail, SS agents detained him at the port. They gave him no explanation. He was put in a vehicle and taken to Berlin. During the journey, he was beaten several times. Reports speak of ill treatment during the trip. Upon arriving in Berlin, he was locked up without trial or a lawyer. At one point, he was informed that he was accused of treason and corruption. This accusation was part of a general excuse to justify the executions to come. Karl Ernst was taken to a makeshift prison and, after several hours of waiting, shot without trial. His body was dumped in a mass grave. The regime allowed no burial, no ceremony, and no detailed official record. They wanted to erase his legacy. At the same time, other SA leaders were also being arrested. Some were executed on the spot. Edmund Heinrich was found in bed with another man, according to the report, and was murdered on the spot. Röhm was left with a pistol in his cell to kill himself, but when he didn't, they executed him anyway, all in less than 48 hours. Before all that, Karl Ernst had been involved in various violent groups and movements that emerged after the collapse of the German Empire. Like other aimless young men after the war, he had joined the Freikorps, a network of former combatants who fought against communists and other groups they considered enemies. Within those circles, Ernst became known for his brutality and loyalty. As street fighting intensified, many Freikorps members joined the SA. Ernst was no exception. Within that force, he found a space where aggression, military order, and political hatred were accepted and promoted. There, he began to rise quickly. He knew how to command authority and how to adapt to what was expected of him. In those early years, rumors were already circulating about his past as a male sex worker. Some sources indicated that he had carried out that activity in Berlin during the years of instability, although he never confirmed or denied it. This part of his life was later used to discredit him when he ceased to be useful to the regime. By 1931, Ernst was already part of the inner circle of Ernst Röhm, the supreme leader of the SA. Röhm also had a background as a soldier and had returned to the country after a period in Bolivia. He shared Ernst's view of violence as a political tool. Furthermore, the two were connected through their private lives, although they never spoke publicly about it. That same year, Röhm returned to Germany and regained full control of the SA. From then on, he protected and promoted several men close to him, including Karl Ernst. In fact, it was Röhm who appointed him head of the Berlin command. With that position, Ernst gained control over thousands of armed men. He controlled street actions, escorts, attacks, and mass events. The SA's structure was pyramidal. Each region had a leader, and each operational section responded with discipline. In Berlin, Ernst was the one in charge. Under his leadership, the city experienced a period of systematic attacks against Nazi rivals. The SA raided communist headquarters, disrupted opposition rallies, and dominated entire neighborhoods. Karl Ernst's presence at official events increased. He was seen at parades, in meetings with party figures, and at propaganda events. He had achieved something rare, rising from the margins to a position of power, supported by Röhm and tolerated by Hitler. During those years, some media outlets not aligned with Nazism published stories suggesting intimate relationships between senior SA commanders. Ernst was mentioned in such notes. One of the best-known episodes was that of Röhm's private letters, which mentioned relationships with young members of the organization. Although the regime attempted to suppress these leaks, the scandals spread. Even so, Hitler did not act immediately. He needed Röhm and his men to consolidate the party's dominance in the streets. But at the same time, he knew that this wing of the movement could become a problem. Röhm had his own ideas. He wanted to transform the SA into a new official military force. This didn't please the generals or the conservative elite. Therefore, the plan to eliminate Röhm and his allies was quietly developed. By early 1934, Hitler already had the support of the armed forces, the Gestapo, and the SS. All he needed was to get rid of the SA to have complete control. It was then that Himmler, Heinrich, and Göring presented him with reports about alleged coup plots by Röhm and his group. The decision was swift. A list was drawn up with the names of those to be eliminated. Karl Ernst was included. The operation was called Calibri. An alleged internal conspiracy would be used as an excuse. The order was clear: immediate arrest without trial and execution. There would be no interrogations or options for defense. Ernst was not in Berlin at the time. He had traveled to Bremen with his wife, whom he had just married. The chosen destination was Tenerife. They planned to spend their honeymoon there. But the SS intercepted him at the port before he boarded the ship. He was arrested without explanation. During the transfer to Berlin, he was not allowed to communicate with anyone. Reports indicate that he was assaulted during the journey. Once in the city, he was locked up in a Gestapo headquarters. There, he spent several hours until he was taken from his cell. There was no trial, no formal charges were filed. He was executed in secret, and his body disappeared without official record. At the same time, other SA leaders were eliminated one by one. Heinrich was caught in a room with another man. He was shot without delay. Röhm was taken to a cell where he was left with a gun to take his own life. When he didn't, they killed him. The operation lasted less than 2 days. Dozens of people were killed. After that, Hitler announced that he had foiled an internal coup. He justified the killings as an act of defense of the state. He said Röhm had betrayed the cause and that other SA members were implicated. He didn't mention Karl Ernst by name. He only included him as one of those who were no longer useful. Ernst's death was a warning. No one was safe. Those who had once been useful could be discarded without warning, and his story would be expunged from the records. He was given no credit for any role, no merit, not even a grave. He was erased. Years later, some survivors recounted details of that purge. They spoke of fear, of warrantless arrests, of shootings in basements. The SA was dismantled. Their place was taken by the SS, which from then on became the regime's main force. Karl Ernst was one of the first to fall. His life went from anonymity to the highest circles of power, and from there to silence. His name disappeared from speeches. The photos in which he appeared were removed, and his figure was transformed into a warning to others. No one spoke of his past anymore, not of his role in building Nazi power, not of his ties to Röhm, not of his death. His story was silenced by the very system that had used him. Röhm and the homosexual heart of the SA, myths, alliances, and betrayals. From the beginning of the National Socialist movement, there was a sector within the party that organized itself violently, with its own hierarchies and internal codes that were not discussed in public. This group was the SA. Its leader was Ernst Röhm, a veteran soldier who made no secret of his preference for younger men. Unlike other party leaders, he did not hide his way of life. Röhm had a close circle made up of men who, like him, had come from the war and shared his vision of politics and direct action. Within this group were Edmund Heinrich and Karl Ernst. Both held important positions within the SA structures. Both had a reputation for brutality. Both were mentioned in internal reports for their close ties to Röhm. By 1931, when Hitler appointed him absolute leader of the SA, Röhm had already formed a loyal team. Among his closest allies were Karl Ernst, who controlled Berlin, and Heinrich, who was in charge in Silesia. All three shared the same command style: direct, straightforward, and with constant use of violence. Homosexuality within the SA was no secret. Although German laws of the time criminalized such behavior, there was explicit tolerance among the SA's high command. Röhm's entourage was known for this. Even the party's top leader, Adolf Hitler, knew about it. But for years, he turned a blind eye because he needed the SA to consolidate power. Archives indicate that in February 1931, after the expulsion of the SA chief from Berlin, Hitler decided to appoint Paul Schulz as head of that unit. Schulz, in turn, promoted Heinrich and Ernst. Both were part of the group that opponents called Röhm's Boys. This nickname was no coincidence. The anti-Nazi press of the time had already published testimonies and documents that spoke of an internal network of relationships between SA commanders. Some articles accused them of handling key positions through intimate ties. Most of these publications were censored, but the rumors continued. One of the most notorious episodes occurred when Helmut Klotz, a former Nazi who had defected to the Social Democratic Party, published private letters from Röhm in which he spoke openly about his preferences. In one of these notes, he referred to the men around him as his comrades in every sense. Among those named were Ernst and Heinrich. After this revelation, Klotz was attacked in the parliamentary cafe. Heinrich and other Nazi deputies beat him in front of several witnesses. There was no punishment, but the incident was recorded. It was a sign of the lengths they were willing to go to silence those who spoke out on such matters. The scandal was amplified when Walter Stennis's statements surfaced. This former SA commander in Berlin had broken with Röhm in 1931. In a public letter, he stated that he would not accept orders from a man surrounded by male prostitutes. He claimed that Röhm and his group used the organization as a cover for their personal actions. These words provoked an internal crisis. Some sectors within the party demanded explanations, but Hitler intervened and closed the matter. He protected Röhm, arguing that what mattered was his organizational ability. From that moment on, any discussion of the private lives of SA leaders was prohibited. Röhm kept his post, and with him, his allies remained in office. Ernst consolidated his position in Berlin. Heinrich strengthened his area. Both were feared. Both received direct support from their leader. The SA continued to grow, and within it, Röhm's inner circle maintained control. Some current research suggests that Röhm promoted a type of closed male community where relationships between men were part of the bond of loyalty. This idea was not new. Some theorists at the beginning of the century had already discussed it. For Röhm, the SA were more than a shock troop. They were a group united by shared experiences. Within that environment, Karl Ernst stood out for his ability to mobilize men and organize acts of violence. His relationship with Röhm was not merely political. They shared spaces, decisions, and trust. This closeness was what, years later, placed him among the first targets for elimination. Edmund Heinrich was also a strong figure. He had a reputation for brutality. Extrajudicial killings, beatings, and threats were attributed to him. He was promoted thanks to Röhm. He had a reputation within the party, and like Ernst, he was mentioned several times in classified reports about the internal network surrounding the SA leader. The party's tolerance for such practices had a limit. As long as the SA was useful, Hitler defended it, but as they grew in number and power, they began to cause discomfort. The army leadership, for example, viewed Röhm with suspicion. They feared that with his millions of followers, he would try to replace the regular army. By 1934, this tension reached its breaking point. The SA already had more than 3 million members. Röhm had begun to speak publicly about the need for a new armed force of the people, controlled by him. This alarmed the generals. It also worried Hitler. Internal SS and Gestapo reports began to focus on men close to Röhm. Profiles were drawn up of Karl Ernst, Heinrich, and other regional leaders. There was talk of suspicious activities, private parties, and behavior the regime could not justify. One of those documents mentioned a meeting attended by Ernst, Heinrich, and other SA commanders. The location was described as a rest house on the outskirts of Berlin. There, according to the report, plans to consolidate Röhm's power within the party were discussed. Behavior considered unacceptable for official discourse was also recorded. The pressure was mounting. The SS, led by Himmler, began to present these reports as evidence that Röhm was no longer responsive to the party. It was said that he was preparing a coup, that his men, including Ernst and Heinrich, were ready to act, and that his personal practices were a threat to the image of the regime. Hitler found himself between two fires. On the one hand, he needed the SA as a pressure force. On the other, the army commanders demanded that he restore order. The final decision came in June 1934. The entire Röhm circle was ordered eliminated. Ernst and Heinrich were on the list. The plan was activated on the night of June 30th, 1934. The operation was codenamed Calibri. Members of the SS, the Gestapo, and other units loyal to Hitler participated. The orders were clear: arrest Röhm and the closest SA leaders. Among the targets were Karl Ernst, Edmund Heinrich, and several regional commanders. Edmund Heinrich was found in a room with another man. The officers who entered the room reported that both were naked. Heinrich offered no resistance. He was arrested immediately. A few hours later, he was shot without trial. He was not allowed to speak. There were no questions and no defense. Karl Ernst, for his part, had left Berlin to travel with his wife. He was in the port of Bremen, ready to embark for his honeymoon. He was intercepted by SS men before boarding the ship. He received no explanation. He was put into a vehicle and taken without delay to Berlin. En route, he was beaten. Upon arrival, he was immediately executed. Ernst Röhm was arrested in the spa town of Bad Wiessee. He was housed there with some of his entourage. During the raid, several of his companions were killed on the spot. He was taken to a prison. Hitler had ordered that he be given a pistol to take his own life. Röhm refused. A few hours later, 2 SS men entered his cell and killed him. In total, more than 80 were executed in those hours. Some died in hotels, others in prisons or barracks. There were no trials, nor was there any subsequent investigation. The decision had already been made. The SA was to be dismantled, and Röhm's entourage was to be completely eliminated. After the events, Hitler gave a speech in which he claimed to have suppressed an internal conspiracy. He said Röhm and his circle were planning a coup against the government, that their intentions were to betray the party, that he had acted in defense of the state. He made no mention of the private lives of those executed, but the rumors circulated unchecked. Newspapers controlled by the regime published articles justifying the murders. They referred to the moral conduct of those involved. They spoke of vice, corruption, and sexual scandals. They mentioned Karl Ernst, Heinrich, and others without providing details, but making it clear that they no longer represented the party ideal. Instead, the official version was that a betrayal had been stopped, that those executed were a threat to the unity of the country, and that the purge had been necessary. This version was repeated at public events, in speeches, and in official documents. The story was adjusted to erase the uncomfortable details. The case of Karl Ernst was one of the most striking. He had been a key figure in Berlin. He had organized mass rallies, controlled the streets, and always responded to party orders. But after his execution, his name disappeared from the records. Photos, reports, and mentions were eliminated. No burial was authorized. Edmund Heinrich was also never mentioned again. Despite having held a high position in the SA, his figure was erased. The version that remained was that of a traitor with no further explanation. The same happened with other men close to Röhm. They were left out of the official history of the regime. In the following years, the SA lost strength. The SS, under Himmler's command, took its place. It became the new armed structure of the regime. It had power, autonomy, a budget, and complete control of the security forces. The elimination of Röhm and his group paved the way for that change. Homosexuality, which had been tolerated in certain circles of the party, began to be used as a motive for persecution. Beginning in 1935, the regime tightened laws against acts between men. Mass arrests were made, meeting places were closed, surveillance campaigns were organized. This shift was exploited by official propaganda. It was said that the regime was fighting degeneration, that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, that the party had been cleansed, that the guilty had been punished. This narrative justified what happened to Röhm, Ernst, and everyone else. In reality, the purge of the SA wasn't just a moral issue, it was a political move. Hitler needed the support of the army and the economic elite. The SA was seen as a threat to both. Röhm had his own ideas. He wanted a revolution within the regime. His men, like Ernst and Heinrich, supported him. That made them enemies. The execution of Karl Ernst showed that no position guaranteed security. That being useful wasn't enough. That at any moment the party could turn and eliminate its own members. That loyalty did not protect against a political decision. Relationships between men within the SA were no longer tolerated. They were used as evidence of treason. What had previously been allowed in silence was now grounds for arrest. The private lives of those executed became an argument to erase them from history. In Röhm's case, his position as head of the SA made him a prime target, but without his allies it would not have been possible to maintain his power. Karl Ernst organized operations in the capital. Heinrich imposed discipline in his region. Both carried out their orders without question. That is why they were also eliminated. The history of Röhm's circle was hidden by the regime. For years, people avoided talking about them. When they appeared in documents or photographs, they were cropped or eliminated. Their names were removed from official lists. Silence was imposed as a form of control. Only after the end of the regime were documents, testimonies, and records recovered that made it possible to reconstruct what happened. The internal relationships within the SA became known. The executions without trial were confirmed. The purge was understood to be an internal cleansing, not a response to a real conspiracy. Karl Ernst was one of the most affected. His rise was swift. His fall immediate. His body was never returned. His history was erased. He went from being commander of Berlin to being disappeared. Only the memory of those who knew him remained. And the reports recovered later. Hitler's motives, fear, power, and the pressure of the army. In the first months of 1934, Hitler was already head of government and had the support of a large portion of the population. But he didn't control everything. The German army, although limited by international treaties, still retained its structure, its commands, and its influence. The SA, on the other hand, was a large force, without formal military training, but with a massive presence in the streets. This situation generated tension that increased every week. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, had a different vision. He thought his organization should become the country's new army. He made no secret of his intentions. He expressed this in meetings, in speeches, and in private letters. He believed the Nazi revolution was not over, that a complete transformation of the system was still needed. For him, the SA was the instrument to achieve that. Röhm's proposal was clear: merge the SA with the regular army, create a single force under his control. That in practice meant that the army officers would become subordinates to someone like Röhm. The generals didn't accept that idea. They saw Röhm as an agitator without tactical training. They didn't want to share power with him or his followers. Hitler was sandwiched between these two blocks. On the one hand, he owed his rise to the support of the SA. It was thanks to their actions in the streets that the Nazi Party managed to consolidate itself. But on the other, he knew he needed the army to stay in power. He couldn't fight two fronts at the same time, and the generals demanded a definition. The situation became more urgent when President Paul von Hindenburg began to fall ill. He was an elderly man, a symbol of traditional authority. When he died, Hitler wanted to assume his place as head of state, but to do that, he needed the full support of the army. Without it, he couldn't guarantee a conflict-free transfer of power. The military leaders, led by Werner von Blomberg, made it clear that they would not accept such a succession if the SA continued to grow. They demanded that Röhm be reined in, that the power of his men be limited, that the parades, parallel training, and provocative speeches be stopped. The condition was simple: if Hitler wanted their support, he must get rid of the SA. Hitler understood this, but it wasn't an immediate decision. For weeks, he tried to calm the generals without breaking with Röhm. He asked him to moderate his language, to avoid talking about revolution, to stop calling for the unification of forces. Röhm refused. He insisted that the change must continue. He thought Hitler would support him to the end. At the same time, reports began to circulate from the SS and the Gestapo about an alleged betrayal within the SA. It was said that Röhm and his entourage were planning an uprising, that they wanted to overthrow the government and take control, that they had armed men all over the country, that they had hit lists and detailed plans. There is no evidence that such a coup was actually underway. But the documents were used to convince Hitler that he had to act. Himmler, head of the SS, and Reinhard Heydrich, head of the secret police, prepared a plan to eliminate Röhm and his main allies. Göring, another of Hitler's close associates, also joined in. The operation was designed to be carried out in just a few days. The official rationale was treason. The arrests would be made without warning. There would be no trials. No defense would be allowed. The idea was to wipe out the SA leadership in a single move. The code name chosen was Calibri. Before putting the plan into action, Hitler traveled to Bad Wiessee, where Röhm was resting. He wanted to see with his own eyes whether he was really planning something. He found it peaceful, with no signs of conspiracy, but it no longer mattered. The decision had been made. It was necessary to nip the conflict with the army in the bud. On June 30th, 1934, the raid began. At the same time, in various cities, SS and police agents arrested dozens of SA leaders. Among them were Karl Ernst, Edmund Heinrich, and other regional leaders. Some were executed on the spot. Others were taken away to be shot. The speed of the operation was crucial. There was no time to react. In less than 48 hours, the SA command structure was destroyed. Röhm was arrested and taken to prison. He was offered a pistol to take his own life. When he refused, he was murdered in his cell. The rest were eliminated without exception. Hitler announced the events in a radio speech. He said he had foiled an attempted coup, that he had acted in defense of the state, that those killed were traitors. He didn't name everyone. He gave no details. He only repeated that order must be maintained. The army's reaction was immediate. The generals congratulated Hitler on his decision. They swore loyalty to him. From that moment on, they recognized him as their supreme commander. When Hindenburg died a few weeks later, Hitler assumed leadership of the state unopposed. He now held all the power. The purge also sent a message to the other sectors of the party. It showed that no one was above the structure, that alliances could be broken, that power did not guarantee immunity, that any suspicion was sufficient reason to disappear. From then on, the SA was reduced to a symbolic force. It lost autonomy. It was controlled by the SS. It no longer had a leading role. Its former leaders were eliminated or silenced. New appointees answered directly to Hitler. The army, on the other hand, regained privileges. He was promised that there would be no other force to match him. The expansion of armaments was authorized. Expansion plans were resumed. The generals were integrated into the new system, no longer as adversaries but as part of the project. Hitler's move was calculated. He sacrificed those who had aided his rise to consolidate his position. He used the supposed internal threat as an excuse, and he eliminated an entire power network that no longer served him. He did this without a trial, without evidence, without the right to reply. Karl Ernst, Edmund Heinrich, and many others were left out of the official narrative. Their names were erased. Their time in the party was ignored. History was rewritten. The enemy was now them. What they had done before didn't matter. Only what the regime said about them now counted. The elimination of the SA was justified as an emergency measure, but records show that the plan had been prepared in advance. Himmler and Heinrich had spent weeks gathering intelligence, compiling lists, and organizing the teams that would execute the operation. Göring coordinated the movements from Berlin. There was no improvisation. The files recovered after the war contain internal notes detailing the names of the targets. Karl Ernst was among the first. His closeness to Röhm, his leadership in Berlin, and his influence within the movement made him dangerous to the new plans. Edmund Heinrich was also marked from the start. The SS agents knew where to find each one. They had travel routes, schedules, addresses. When the order was issued, they acted without hesitation. Some were taken from their beds, others were intercepted in hotels or stations. In Ernst's case, they caught him in the port of Bremen as he was about to embark with his wife. The same happened with other regional leaders. Some tried to resist, but they were subdued in seconds. There were no interrogations, nor were there long transfers. In many cases, the executions were carried out on the spot, without witnesses, without explanations. The objective was for the coup to be total. Despite the violence, most media outlets applauded the decision. The regime-controlled press published articles that spoke of traitors, plots, and moral deviations. The private lives of those executed were used as a tool to discredit them. They were presented as corrupt, immoral, and internal enemies. Official speeches focused on 2 points: the need to maintain order and cleanliness within the party. Hitler presented himself as a leader who acted firmly. He said he would not allow divisions, that any attempt to break unity would be crushed, that the state was above all else. That narrative worked. The population, for the most part, accepted the government's version. Public events continued, the salutes remained, the posters remained unchanged. Only a few voices abroad questioned what had happened, but within the country, control was almost total. With the SA weakened, Hitler was able to focus on other sectors of power. He reached agreements with industrialists. He negotiated with the army command. He strengthened the role of the SS, and he secured his control over the state apparatus. The purge had been a key move to consolidate his absolute rule. In the following years, the official version of history was tailored to the regime's needs. Röhm was erased from the public eye. The photos of him alongside Hitler were cropped, his speeches were eliminated, his writings were censored. The same happened to Karl Ernst and the others executed. The few documents that remained were kept in secret archives. They were not spoken of in schools or at party events. Their names were not mentioned. Their role in the rise of the movement was silenced. They had gone from heroes to traitors in a matter of hours. Only after the fall of the regime was it possible to reconstruct the true sequence of events. Signed orders, execution reports, and lists of victims were found. It became known that there had been no trial, that most of the accused did not even know why they were arrested, that the charges were vague or trumped up. The elimination of the SA also marked a shift in the regime's ideological approach. The revolutionary aspect of the movement was suppressed. Speeches about social justice, redistribution, and class struggle were abandoned. In their place, order, discipline, and blind obedience were reinforced. This benefited the most conservative sectors. Business leaders, the military, and bureaucrats felt more comfortable with the new direction. The old promises of transformation were set aside. The party became more hierarchical, more rigid, more aligned with traditional structures. Karl Ernst, who had represented the aggressive face of the movement in the streets, no longer fit into that scheme. His style, his history, his role in the early years were an uncomfortable memory. That's why he was eliminated. Not only physically, but also from official memory. Edmund Heinrich, with his reputation for toughness and his relationship with Röhm, was also erased. The new generations within the party didn't know who they had been. And if they asked, they received vague answers or lies. History had been modified to suit the needs of the moment. The army, meanwhile, was gaining power. It was allowed to expand. It was granted new resources. It was guaranteed autonomy. In return, it swore loyalty to Hitler personally. That pact sealed the country's fate. The head of government no longer knew his limits. In short, Hitler's motives for acting against the SA were manifold. He needed to calm the army. He wanted to consolidate his control. He had to eliminate potential pockets of resistance. And furthermore, he sought to send a clear message. Power was in his hands, and no one could challenge him. Operation Calibri was the tool to achieve that. An internal cleansing disguised as a defense of the state. A political move executed with precision. A sign that the regime did not hesitate to act against its own members if necessary. Karl Ernst was a key player in that story. His rise and fall show how the system worked, how people were used while they served, and how they were discarded when they were no longer useful. Without trial, without explanation, without memory. The Night of the Long Knives, the arrest and assassination of Karl Ernst. On the night of June 30th, 1934, an operation that had been secretly planned for weeks was launched, codenamed Calibri. It was carried out by members of the SS and secret police agents. Its objective was to eliminate SA leaders who were seen as a problem for the new order Hitler wanted to establish. Karl Ernst was at the top of the list. He was the head of the SA in Berlin and had played an important role in the preceding years. He had been part of the seizure of power in the capital. He had led street actions. He had demonstrated loyalty to the party, but he was also close to Röhm, and that at that moment made him a target. That day, Karl Ernst was out of Berlin. He had traveled to Bremen to embark for Tenerife. The trip was part of his honeymoon. He had recently married a young woman named Beata. Both were at the port, ready to board the SS St. Louis, when SS officers intercepted him. The men approached him quietly. They identified him. They offered no explanations. They put him in a vehicle. Beta remained on the dock, not understanding what was happening. There was no warrant, no formal charge, just a quick, silent, and direct arrest. Karl Ernst was taken by train to Berlin. During the journey, he was beaten. Some witnesses later testified that he was tied with ropes, that he was insulted, that he was denied food and water. The journey lasted several hours. Upon arriving in the capital, he was not taken to a prison or a security office. He was taken directly to an SS barracks. Other SA leaders had also been detained there. Edmund Heinrich, for example, had been arrested that same morning. He had been found in a room with another man. Both were naked. They did not resist. Heinrich was shot a few hours later in the courtyard of a police station. Karl Ernst's execution was ordered without a trial. He was not allowed to testify. He was not given a lawyer. He was taken from the vehicle and taken to a basement. There, without being charged, he was forced to kneel. He was shot in the head. He died there. No one recovered his body. His family was not informed. There was no funeral. At the same time, other SA leaders suffered the same fate. In different cities, armed men entered homes, hotels, and offices. They arrested, beat, and killed. Some were executed in the street, others in the basements of official buildings. No questions were accepted, no witnesses were admitted. Silence was part of the plan. The order came directly from Hitler. He had signed the authorization to carry out Operation Calibri. In it, he had branded Röhm, Ernst, Heinrich, and several others as deviants and traitors. The word treason was used as justification, but the details were never made public. The next day's newspapers reported that a coup attempt had been foiled, that the SA was planning to assassinate the head of state, that there were lists of names, that secret meetings had been detected. No evidence was shown, no documents were presented, only statements repeated by official spokesmen. The case of Karl Ernst was not mentioned in detail. It was said that he had been arrested as part of the operation, that he was linked to Röhm's plans, that he had been removed from his post. There was no report that he had been executed, nor was his wife mentioned. His name disappeared from the records within a few days. The Gestapo ordered all references to his career erased. In party archives, his file was removed. In official photographs, his face was obscured or cropped. At public events, he was not mentioned again. The same was true of other men eliminated that night. The speed of the events was part of the success of the operation. Röhm was arrested in Bad Wiessee by Hitler himself. He was resting in a hotel. He had no weapons. He was taken to Stadelheim prison. There, he was offered a pistol to take his own life. When he refused, he was murdered by 2 SS officers. It is estimated that more than 80 people were executed during the Night of the Long Knives. Some sources claim the actual number was higher than 150. Most were members of the SA. Others were politicians, former rivals, or internal enemies of the regime. All died without trial. Fear spread in the following weeks. No one asked, no one spoke. In the party offices, group photos were revised. The faces of the fallen were removed. In schools, books were updated. In speeches, names were changed. The official memorandum was rewritten. Karl Ernst's wife never saw him again. She received no notification. She couldn't recover her belongings. She wasn't allowed to make any demands. She lived out the rest of her days without knowing the details of her husband's death. The regime didn't acknowledge mistakes. It offered no explanations. It only dictated silence. After Karl Ernst's assassination, documents related to him were ordered destroyed. The SA archives in Berlin were reviewed. Orders bearing his signature were withdrawn. Reports were burned, lists were erased, and references were removed. Soon his name ceased to appear in party papers. The same procedure was applied in the other cities. Any trace of those executed was eliminated. Headquarters were instructed to suppress all links with them. Even in internal meetings, discussion of the missing was avoided. It was as if they had never been part of the movement. Gestapo agents ensured that the purge was complete. They supervised libraries, press archives, photographs, and publications. If any image of Karl Ernst appeared, it was requested to be changed. If anyone mentioned him in public, they were interrogated. Silence was part of the punishment. Karl Ernst's disappearance was total. There was no grave, no farewell ceremony. His body was never released. His death was not recorded in the regime's official lists. For the government, he had simply ceased to exist. For years, the details of his arrest and execution remained unknown. Only after the fall of the regime were reports recovered. Some internal SS and Gestapo notes confirmed the place of his death. Statements from agents who participated in the operation were also found. One of these documents mentions that Karl Ernst was taken to the Oranienburg concentration camp before being executed. There, the SS already had facilities for special detainees. He was taken to a windowless cell. There he spent his last hours. He was not allowed contact with anyone. He received no visitors or messages. Another report indicates that he was murdered along with 2 other SA officers. All 3 were forced to kneel. A group of 5 armed men carried out the execution. Each fired 2 shots. The bodies were then wrapped in tarpaulins and transported in a truck. Their final destination was not recorded. Some officers mentioned that the bodies were cremated, others that they were buried in an unmarked grave within the camp itself. There is no certainty. The only thing that is clear is that there was never any intention to return them to their families. The order was to completely disappear them. Karl Ernst's story was thus silenced. He was not even mentioned in the foreign press. His widow Beta tried to find out what had happened. She sent letters. She consulted acquaintances. She received no response. She was kept under surveillance for some time. She was forbidden to speak about the matter. She eventually abandoned the search. After 1945, during the Nuremberg trials, Karl Ernst's name appeared in some statements. He was mentioned as one of the leaders killed without trial on the night of June 30th, but nothing was pursued. No charges were brought for his death. Those responsible were already dead or had destroyed the records. The murder of Karl Ernst was one of the many acts used by Hitler to consolidate his control. By eliminating figures like him, the regime sent a clear message. No one was safe, not the founders of the movement, not the regional leaders, not those who had been loyal to the end. The Night of the Long Knives was later remembered as the moment when power became absolute. There was no turning back. From then on, Hitler no longer needed to justify his actions. An order was enough. The controlling structures responded without delay. Karl Ernst, who had led the SA in Berlin, who had been involved in organizing mass rallies, who had participated in the party's rise to power, was erased from history. He was not a martyr. He was not a hero. He was not a traitor in real terms. He was simply a man discarded for reasons of convenience. His story, like that of others, shows how the regime's internal system worked, how shifts in loyalty, strategic needs, and fear could lead to the elimination of close allies, how the structure adapted to every moment regardless of the cost. Operation Calibri wasn't just a military action, it was also an ideological purge, a trimming of what no longer fit, a cleansing to redefine the party's course. And in that process, men like Karl Ernst were erased from the collective memory. Today, the documents found allow us to reconstruct part of his story, not with complete details, not with complete certainty, but with sufficient evidence to understand that his death was part of a planned strategy, that there was no error, that it wasn't excessive, that it was a premeditated execution. Karl Ernst's case represents the human cost of the political decisions made at the top of the regime, an example of how loyalty guaranteed nothing, of how alliances could be broken in seconds, and how official history could be rewritten without leaving any traces. The fall of Röhm and the political use of homosexuality. Ernst Röhm, supreme leader of the SA, had been one of Hitler's first allies. He had returned from Bolivia in 1931 to reorganize the structure of the assault groups. Under his command, the SA grew to over 3 million members. They had a presence throughout the country. They trained as a parallel force. They marched through the streets. They had their own uniform, and they answered directly to Röhm. From the beginning, Röhm made no secret of his sexual orientation. Several party members knew he had relationships with men. He didn't consider it a secret. For him, his private life didn't interfere with his duties. He even referred to his tastes naturally in some personal letters. He had no intention of hiding it. This attitude caused discomfort in some sectors of the party, especially among the more conservative ones. Some considered him immoral, others a threat to the image of the movement. But as long as Röhm maintained his closeness to Hitler and his control over the SA, no one confronted him directly. As tensions between the SA and the army grew, rumors began to circulate. There was talk of secret parties, of private meetings in hotels, of relationships between high-ranking officers. The information was used by the SS and the Gestapo. Reports were accumulated, notes were taken, everything was stored. Heinrich, head of the secret police, ordered files to be compiled on Röhm and his entourage. Testimonies were collected, photos were taken, phone calls were monitored. Evidence of behavior considered deviant was sought. The objective was clear: to have arguments to use against him when the time came. When Hitler decided to eliminate Röhm, those documents became useful tools. They served to justify his downfall, to convince the military commanders, to explain to the public why a man so close to the head of state was being executed. Röhm's homosexuality went from being a known fact to a political excuse. One of the episodes most used as evidence was the arrest of Edmund Heinrich. He was found in bed with another man. Both were arrested. The scene was described in detail in internal reports. It was asserted that such behavior was incompatible with service to the state, that it violated the values of the movement. Heinrich was shot hours later. These events were presented as examples of internal corruption, as signs that the SA had lost its way, that its leaders were no longer trustworthy, that they had fallen into vice, abuse, and debauchery. The sexual accusation served to reinforce the official narrative. After the purge, newspapers spoke openly of Röhm's indecent behavior. It was said that he had set up a network of favors, that he offered positions in exchange for relationships, that the SA had become a closed circle of forbidden practices. None of this was proven with real evidence, but it served to destroy his image. Photos of Röhm disappeared from the archives. His name was erased from speeches. Recordings were destroyed. Books were eliminated. Even copies of the newspaper in which he appeared were removed. Images showing him with Hitler were edited. Only versions that did not include him remained. Röhm's homosexuality, which had previously been tolerated, became a direct accusation. It was used to publicly discredit him, to erase his role in the history of the movement, and to justify his murder. The regime exploited social prejudice and turned it into a political tool. The same happened with others executed during the Night of the Long Knives. Some were presented as part of an immoral network. Unconfirmed stories were spread. Details were exaggerated. They were shown as corrupt, not only politically but also personally. This helped to reduce any sympathy they might have generated. In reality, the central motive for the purge was not the sexual orientation of Röhm or his collaborators. It was the power they had accumulated, Hitler's fear of losing control, pressure from the army. But the sexual accusations served as a useful argument to gain public support. After the purge, policies against homosexuality were toughened. The Gestapo received clear instructions, raids were increased, arrests were made, case files were opened, laws that had previously been partially enforced were now used more vigorously. The Röhm case had drawn a line. After the death of Röhm and the high command of the SS took greater control. Himmler and Heinrich gained power. The SA lost its functions and was limited to parades and minor tasks. Homosexuality, which had previously been tolerated in some cases, became more severely persecuted. Arrests were intensified using Article 175 of the Penal Code. The Gestapo compiled lists, used informants, and opened files. The Röhm case served to justify this repression. In the concentration camps, the accused were marked with a pink triangle, separated from the rest and subjected to forced labor or experiments. Many did not survive. Internally, access to command posts was closed to anyone considered suspicious. The official story obscured the issue. Names, images, and files were eliminated. Karl Ernst was linked to this environment without evidence to justify his execution. His case shows how the regime used private life as a political weapon, eliminating those who no longer served its purposes.